Hey, it's your guy Tyrrell back with the interviews. In today's video, we're going to break down how Frank Lampard won the tactical battle over Pep Guardiola to help Chelsea defeat City at Stamford Bridge. When we break down the game and we do look at the board, we have Chelsea dropping off into more of a 4-5-1, and we ended up seeing City still stick with that 4-3-3. So first, we'll start with how Chelsea were able to cope with City's overall attack, and what we should start looking at is the fact that Bernardo Silva was playing in a false nine role. He was dropping off Christensen and Rudiger, looking to find gaps in between either side of Kante to receive the ball, and when he was very desperate, he was dropping off ahead of that midfield bank. We also saw him shift out to the left-hand side, and that would see Sterling move into more narrow position just ahead of Christensen and Azpilicueta, but that was also based off the fact that Sterling was predominantly one of the sole threats in behind that Chelsea backline. When we look to the wider areas, we did see both Mahrez and Sterling drop off a bit narrow. We saw Mahrez drop off into a narrow position in that midfield zone, but Sterling was in a narrow position just ahead of Azpilicueta and Christensen. The reason why they were able to move into those narrow zones was based off the fact that Mendy and Walker did have space to push forward out in those wider areas, but for the most part down the left-hand side, it was Mendy occupying the width on that touchline and Sterling in those narrow gaps. But on the right-hand side, City were trying to get Marcus Alonso into 1v1 situations with Riyad Mahrez. Then we move into the midfield zone. You had Mason Mount against Kevin De Bruyne, Gundogan against Ross Barkley, and Giroud was looking to block off the passing lanes around Rodri when he could. But what you ended up seeing from that City midfield was that Gundogan and Kevin De Bruyne were looking to move into advanced positions between the lines. So what that meant was that Gundogan and Kevin De Bruyne were pushing beyond the gaps ahead of them, being Willian and Barkley and Pulisic and Mount, to position themselves ahead of the center backs and the fullbacks. The problem now that City encountered was that they couldn't get balls into those players in those dangerous areas based off the fact that Chelsea were very organized, narrow, and compact in that 4-5-1. That did leave space out in the wider areas for the fullbacks to push forward, but what we ended up seeing from Chelsea was that Willian and Pulisic did do a very good job of shifting across throughout that game to ensure that they couldn't cause much of a threat. When you look at how City were aiming to attack, what we've seen from them throughout this season is that they try to get the ball out into the wider areas to pull out the fullbacks, and specifically down the right-hand side, that's where you see Kevin De Bruyne making those darting runs in behind the fullback so that he could deliver quality crosses into the box. That looked like a template that could harm this Chelsea side, but Lampard was well equipped for that danger. On Chelsea's right-hand side, if Azpilicueta was pulled out to Benjamin Mendy, Christensen was quickly into that gap to ensure that if you had Gundogan or Sterling darting into that zone, he was there to ensure that they couldn't deliver crosses into the box. And the same thing applied down that right-hand side. Mahrez was pulling out Marcus Alonso, but if that was the case, you saw Rudiger quickly coming across with Mason Mount. If Mount couldn't get across in that position, you would see Pulisic drop off a bit deeper. Lampard's main concern here was City receiving the ball in those half spaces. So that Chelsea backline was very narrow, and if Pulisic and Willian weren't able to track the runs of the fullbacks or Mahrez, then what would happen was that they would push out into those zones, but you would see the center backs quickly shifting into that zone as a unit. Most sides would have the center backs staying in their position and only shooting out once the run was made, but Chelsea were very disciplined in that regard, and that was the reason why City struggled to create chances, because they couldn't play through the middle, and the only gaps out in the wider areas were closed down by organized team defending. And this is where Guardiola missed Aguero and Gabriel Jesus, because if you have one of those two players constantly looking to break into that 6-yard box, you can't have Christensen or Rudiger shift across to help out the fullbacks. But without a player in that zone, because Bernardo Silva was dropping off a bit deeper, Chelsea could afford to have those players shifting across without leaving a natural goal scorer in a 1v1 situation with their center backs. Ultimately, the main threat threat that City posed in that opening half was through Mendy overlapping runs that Willian wasn't tracking. So now we have to analyze how Chelsea were able to create chances. They struggled to in the early stages of that game due to Manchester City's pressing. And when we looked at how City were looking to press, you would have Bernardo Silva looking to press the center backs, but when he would press a center back, he would be blocking off the passing lane in towards N'Golo Kante. So for instance, if we ended up seeing Bernardo Silva looking to step out to Christensen, then that would leave Sterling on as Azpilicueta, and we would see Mahrez step out to Rudiger, but he would be blocking off the passing lane in towards Marcos Alonso and vice versa. If you have Bernardo Silva stepping out into the path of Rudiger, then you would see Raheem Sterling stepping ahead of Christensen but blocking off the lane to Azpilicueta. There was obviously the option where you could have Bernardo Silva stepping towards Kepa and then having the wider players blocking off the passing lanes between the center backs and the full backs. And if that was the case, then you would see Rodri stepping a bit higher and looking to close down Kante. The one thing that you could say here is that if Kepa was able to lob the balls over Mahrez and Sterling, that would set the fullbacks free. But he was warned early on when Mahrez intercepted one of his poor passes into Bernardo Silva, and that put Chelsea in a nervy moment. The other alternative for City would be to have Bernardo Silva just sitting on Kante and then have the wider players blocking off those passing lanes ahead of the center backs and then force Kepa to build out of the back. Nevertheless, if Chelsea were able to get the ball out to the fullbacks, what we'd end up seeing was that Gundogan or Kevin De Bruyne were shifting across to that spare flank to close down. So Chelsea was struggling with that press, and early on we saw Rudiger and Azpilicueta try to play long to Giroud. And when they were playing long to Giroud, that's when you would see Pulisic looking to make runs across Fernandinho and Kyle Walker in towards that gap beyond the defense. So that was already a warning sign as to how Chelsea were looking to get Pulisic involved. So now when we look to a few examples, what we end up identifying was that Chelsea were able to bypass this City press by having their attacking players, specifically the midfielders and the wider players, dropping off into midfield zones to receive the ball and then looking to offload it out into the wider areas. When we look to one example, what we end up seeing is Sterling stepping into the path of Christensen with Bernardo Silva near Kante. Christensen's able to wrap the ball around Sterling into the path of Barkley dropping off Gundogan. When Barkley receives the ball, we do see Bernardo shifting towards him, but as Barkley faces City's half, what he ends up locating is Rodri stepping towards him and Pulisic running off Walker, and that's where you see him clipping the diagonal ball out to Pulisic with Marcos Alonso underlapping. When we look to another example, this time we highlight City's disjointed pressing. You have Bernardo stepping out into the path of Kepa and Sterling near Christensen, and what you end up seeing here is that Kepa plays the ball around Bernardo into a free Kante with Rodri stepping late. Based off the fact that Rodri steps late, Kante has time to receive the ball, turn, and then split Sterling and Rodri to find Azpilicueta pushing forward. Now with Azpilicueta free, Gundogan has to shift over to that flank to cover, and he does a good job of blocking off the passing lane into Barkley. But what we see from Chelsea here is that Willian drops off Mendy, and we also see Christian Pulisic running across Kyle Walker and Fernandinho and looking to dart into that gap between Fernandinho and Laporte to receive a long ball. Azpilicueta opts for the pass into the path of Willian across Gundogan, and when Willian receives that ball, he instantly switches it out to Marcos Alonso, who is free based off the fact that, once again, you have the wider players looking to press the center back, so they are the spare man, and De Bruyne isn't shifting across because he's on Mason Mount. When we look to another example, this time we highlight the movement of Pulisic. We have Christensen on the ball ahead of Bernardo Silva and Gundogan, and he ends up splitting them both to find Pulisic dropping off Mendy. So when that pass is played, Pulisic instantly flicks it into the path of Giroud dropping off, and with Laporte not tight on him, what Giroud does locate is Mason Mount running off Kevin De Bruyne, who isn't tracking his movement. So he leaves the ball and takes Laporte out of the game, and that's when we see Mason Mount get on the ball. Mount now sees a gap between Mendy and Fernandinho to play in Pulisic, but when he plays that pass into Pulisic, it is overhit. Following those chances, Pulisic was able to put Chelsea ahead following a miscommunication between Gundogan and Mendy. So even when we look to the second half, we didn't see much change in the overall tactical pattern. We did see City get Gundogan and Kevin De Bruyne more in those gaps between the lines. But like I said, Chelsea were doing a very good job of shutting out those half spaces. However, when we look to the decisive moments, they also follow a similar theme. For instance, when we look to the build-up to how City were able to win that free kick, it did see Sterling pressing Azpilicueta, it did see Azpilicueta playing a long ball into Giroud, and it also saw Pulisic running across Fernandinho and Walker in behind that Chelsea defense. The issue here is that Laporte wins that ball over Giroud, De Bruyne receives it in that midfield zone, and then because Chelsea are pulled out of position, De Bruyne is able to split Willian and Mason Mount to find Mahrez, and that's when you end up seeing Kante foul him. But in those final minutes building up to Chelsea's winner, you saw the significance of the Abraham change for Giroud. Initially, Kyle Walker got City off the hook. It was Christensen's long ball into Abraham, where this time Laporte was tight on him and couldn't win the ball like he did to Giroud in the build-up to City's equalizer, that ended up seeing the ball bounce across Fernandinho for Pulisic continuously making that run in behind. Pulisic does round Ederson and he tries to finish into that open net, but Kyle Walker clears it off the line. But as you can see, this was a Frank Lampard masterclass. While both sides could have scored goals in transition, what we could say about Chelsea is besides those Benjamin Mendy overlapping runs, they neutralized Manchester City's overall attacking threat and they ensured that they couldn't receive the ball in the half spaces for the pullbacks. Meanwhile, when you look at Chelsea, yes, they did encounter some issues with City's pressing, but they were able to consistently bypass it and put themselves into good positions as they created the better chances in this game. Hi everybody, thanks for watching and subscribe here for your latest tactical analysis and daily commentary on the InnerViews show. And if that wasn't enough, don't forget you could find more organic, unfiltered soccer/football analysis on the InnerViews podcast, the best soccer/football podcast in the world, available on iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and any Android apps on your Android devices.